Eldritch sat in Varus's small, dimly lit home, staring into the crackling fire. He had abandoned Duncan's grand house, left it to the servants, to the broken souls that once obeyed the master's every violent whim. It held no meaning to him. He was no ruler, no tyrant. Varus, ever watchful, poured a drink into a roughly carved wooden cup, handing it to Eldritch. "You're still thinking about leaving?" Eldritch didn't answer at first, simply watching the flames twist and dance. "This isn't my place. I need to find a way back." Varus exhaled, leaning back. "Then you already know the answer." Eldritch turned to him, brow furrowed. "Do I?" Varus smirked, taking a sip from his cup. "There is only one way in and out of this place, Eldritch. You know it. I know it. Everyone here knows it." A silence hung between them. Finally, Varus leaned in. "Nocturna." Eldritch clenched his jaw. He had known since he awoke in this cursed land, but saying it aloud gave it weight. Nocturna held the strings. Nocturna controlled the board. Nocturna decided who stayed and who left. If there was any chance of escaping, he would have to confront the god himself. Eldritch let out a breath. "Then I need to find a way to force his hand." The Council of Elders. A looming fear. Across the village, in a secluded gathering hall, the oldest of the elders sat in a flickering candle-lit chamber. They spoke in hushed tones, voices layered with centuries of fear. An elder, Callus, stood. "We have not seen them since Duncan arrived." Murmurs followed. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably. Another elder, Tyriel, narrowed her gaze. "And now that Duncan is gone." A silence. Then Callus spoke the words they all feared. "Then nothing is stopping them from coming back." Tension thickened. A younger elder, Lorik, shifted uneasily. "We've had peace for centuries because Duncan kept them at bay. He was strong enough to force them back. Without him..." He exhaled sharply. "They will come." Theriel's expression darkened. "The Blood Warriors." A stillness settled over the room. They had all seen what happened to elders who failed Nocturna's bargain. Those who lived too long. Those who were devoured by the very power they once wielded. They did not die. They became something else. And now they would rise once more. The feeding grounds, Nocturna's whisper. A realm without horizon, stretching into eternity. A land of blackened, pulsating crimson, shifting, writhing, devouring. This was the feeding grounds, the place where fallen elders, once whole, now rotted within the blood-soaked abyss. Nocturna stood at its edge, his form a shifting void, barely distinguishable from the endless night sky above. He raised a hand. His whisper carried on the wind. "The Master is no more." The words slithered across the realm, sinking into the parasitic land below. The ground stirred. The figures, half submerged in the abyss, twitched, gasped, snarled. For eons they had suffered, devoured, melted into the feeding grounds. For centuries they had clawed at the edges of oblivion, waiting. They were elders once. Now they were only hunger. Nocturna whispered again. "The village is unprotected." Their bodies shuddered as they began to pull themselves free. Hundreds of them, twisted, broken, their limbs stretched unnaturally, their eyes hollow pits of endless need. They had tried to reach the village before, but Duncan had kept them trapped, beaten, slaughtered whenever they dared to step beyond the feeding grounds. But now Duncan was gone, and the village stood open. Their sunken mouths widened, stretching into silent, twisted screams, their hollow, red eyes fixed forward. For the first time in centuries, they began to move. Their hunger would not be denied. A knock echoed through Varus's small home, breaking the heavy silence between the two men. Varos sighed, setting his cup aside. "Come in." The door creaked open, revealing an elder, his expression grim. His skin was pale and taut, his once regal features worn down by centuries of surviving in Nocturna's realm. Eldritch studied the man as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He was tall, gaunt, draped in a dark, heavy robe that barely concealed the skeletal nature of his frame. The elder's sunken eyes locked onto Eldritch. "I must speak with you." Varos glanced at Eldritch, who gave a small nod. "Go on," Eldritch said. The elder stepped closer to the fire, the glow casting deep shadows across his sharp features. "There is something you must understand about the Blood Warriors." Eldritch listened. The elder's voice was low, measured, but held a weight of fear beneath its calmness. "Long ago, they came, the ones who had already fallen, the ones who had already paid the price for Nocturna's gift, the warriors who had nothing left but their hunger." He paused, staring into the fire. "We thought we were doomed. They came in a horde, hundreds of them, dragging their half-devoured bodies across the blackened land, seeking refuge in the village, seeking to escape the feeding grounds. But Duncan did not let them." The elder's face twitched, as if remembering something he had long tried to forget. He fought them, endlessly, and he enjoyed it. We watched as he tore through them, again and again. No matter how many came, he never faltered. We thought he would grow tired, but he never did. To Duncan, it was a sport, a game, and so, eventually, they stopped coming. Eldritch leaned forward. "They feared him." The elder nodded. "Yes, Duncan was a monster, but even monsters have their uses. He kept them at bay. We lived under his madness. We suffered his wrath, but at least the Blood Warriors did not return." He turned to Eldritch, his voice quieter now. "But Duncan is gone." A cold realization settled in the room. The elder continued, his words edged with certainty. "They will come again." Far beyond the village, beyond the dark plains, across the endless expanse of the feeding grounds, the land shifted. A grotesque mass of blackened crimson pulsed, the ground twisting, writhing as if something beneath was awakening. And then they rose, hundreds. Elders who had once ruled with power, now reduced to shells, their bodies fused with the land, their forms twisted into something inhuman. Some dragged themselves forward, their melted flesh still clinging to the feeding grounds, their bones cracking as they pulled free. Others moved with jerky, unnatural steps, their limbs bending in ways no mortal body should, their mouths gaping open in silent screams of endless hunger, their glowing hollow eyes fixed on the distant village. And they began to march. A shadowed figure stood on the edge of the feeding grounds, watching the Blood Warriors move. Nocturna. His presence warped the air around him, his form barely distinguishable from the eternal blackness that surrounded him. A smirk played across his lips. "Let's see how you handle this, Eldritch." The god of eternal hunger watched, amused. For centuries, Duncan had played his role, but now, with the master gone, the village was vulnerable. This was not a test. This was entertainment. Nocturna wanted to see what Eldritch would do. Would he run? Would he fight? Would he fall? Nocturna chuckled softly as the first wave of Blood Warriors moved closer to the village walls. This was going to be fun. Eldritch sat across from Varos and the Elder, the fire between them casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. The air inside the home was thick with tension. Eldritch steepled his fingers, his mind already working through the problem. "Tell me," he said, his tone calm but measured. "Has there ever been a way to stop them?" The elder hesitated, his face grim. Only with brute force. Silence. Varos sighed, rubbing his temples. Then we are already at a disadvantage, Eldritch said. I do not possess brute strength, nor does anyone in this village. We could create an army, but most here are weak, withered, barely surviving. He looked at the elder. Without our elder powers, we are helpless. The elder's expression darkened. We should never have let you destroy Duncan. Varos turned sharply toward him. Are you serious? Duncan was a lunatic. If he were here, we'd still be suffering under his madness. The elder did not waver. Perhaps, but at least we were safe from the Blood Warriors. Eldritch remained calm, his voice cold and logical. And if we defeat them now, you will have peace. Is that not worth everything? The elder didn't answer immediately. He merely stared into the fire, as if searching for the courage to admit the truth. Finally, after a long silence, he spoke. We do not wish to be forced into the feeding grounds, to be devoured for eternity. Eldritch's gaze didn't waver. Maybe you won't have to. Later that night, Eldritch stood alone at the village's edge, staring out into the endless abyss of the feeding grounds. The wind was still, the sky a void of blackened eternity. The land before him shifted, pulsed, the faintest echoes of voices trapped in the endless hunger. The Blood Warriors were coming. Eldritch spoke to the emptiness. Come on, Eldritch, this is a game of Nocturna. His fingers curled into fists. His mind raced. There has to be a way to win. He thought of Duncan, of brute strength, of overwhelming power, a force so great that the Blood Warriors never dared to rise again. He did not have that. He never would. So how could he win? What would Winter do? Far away on Earth, a figure stood in silence, staring into nothingness. Winter. The wind shifted around him, his chrome mask flickering in the dim light, his stance unmoving, as if he were listening to something beyond mortal perception. The air grew dense with something unseen, a connection, an unspoken conversation across realms, and then, across the infinite expanse of existence, Eldritch heard a single word, a word not spoken, but pushed into his very being. Fear. Eldritch's eyes widened. Fear. That was it. He had been thinking the wrong way. The Blood Warriors did not stop coming because Duncan was strong. They stopped coming because they feared him. Strength wasn't the answer. Terror was. A slow smile crept onto Eldritch's lips. Nocturna, he murmured to the abyss. You've set your game, but now I'm going to play it my way. And for the first time since Duncan's fall, Eldritch knew exactly how to win. Eldritch stood before the Council of Elders, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. The flames flickered across his face, casting shadows that made him look colder than ever. I need workers, he began, and actors. The Elders exchanged confused glances. I need fake blood, lots of it. I need fire. I need a bigger beard and hair. I need a bodysuit to make me look massive. Oh, and I need Duncan's armour, and 6 of your biggest, strongest men and women. Silence. They stared at him as if he had gone mad. Finally, one of the elders scoffed. You want to put on a show? While they force us into the feeding grounds, to be fed on for eternity. Eldritch stepped forward, his presence commanding. That's how we'll decide whether you live or die. Murmurs erupted in the chamber. Varos slammed his fist onto the table, standing up. For the love of our ancestors, do as he says. He barked. He is our best chance. Did he not defeat the master? Some of the elders grumbled but relented. Others nodded in quiet agreement. Eldritch continued, voice steady and unwavering. We will build our illusion at Duncan's house. It is the best location for our deception. I need a trail of blood and bodies leading to it. Make it look like I have already slaughtered many of them before they even arrive." One elder shook his head. "This is insanity. We should fight, not cower behind theatrics." Eldritch turned to him. "Do you have the strength of Duncan? Do you have the power of the Master? Because I don't, and neither do you. If we fight, we lose. But if we make them think Duncan has returned, we win." The elder fell silent. Eldritch leaned in, eyes piercing. "You all fear being sent into the feeding grounds. Then don't be sent. Play your part. Act as if your life depends on it, because it does." The room was quiet. Then finally, an elder sighed. "Fine. What else do you need?" The village comes together. For the first time in centuries, the village worked as one. The smiths hammered metal, forging jagged plates to create a grotesque suit of armour, larger than life, monstrous, impossible to tell if it is even human. The weavers stitched together furs and cloth, creating a massive beard and wild unkempt hair, masking Eldritch's true form. The painters and scavengers collected buckets of deep red liquid, mixing dyes and crushed berries into thick, dark, false blood, enough to paint the streets. Workers lined the village paths with fake corpses, stuffing them with straw and covering them in the illusion of fresh carnage. The blacksmiths pried open Duncan's old armour, reshaping it to fit over Eldritch's deceptive frame. The biggest, strongest villagers were chosen, 6 in total, a mix of men and women, warriors in another life. They would be Duncan's loyal, slaughtered foes, their bodies scattered around the main house, their wounds looking as if they had been torn apart by an unstoppable force. The rest of the villagers boarded up the homes, closing off every path except one, the road leading to Duncan's house. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. They were not warriors, but they had a mind greater than the blade, and now the trap was set. A hunger that never ends. The blood warriors surged forward, an endless tide of writhing flesh and crimson horror, their bodies half-formed, twisted, grotesque. For centuries, they had only known the feeding grounds, their very existence spent being consumed and regenerated in Nocturna's endless hunger. But now for the first time in eternity, they saw land, and they wanted it. They wanted to walk where the land did not feed on them. They wanted to exist without being devoured. They wanted revenge. The first among them crawled onto the solid ground, their bloody, half-melted forms screaming in agony and triumph. Then came more, then more. A wave of horrors, hundreds of them, rising from the feeding grounds like revenants, their faces warped in eternal suffering. And yet, as individual as they seemed, there was one truth among them all. They were connected, bound by the same fate, bound by the same cycle, bound by Nocturna. And so they moved as one. The village, a funnel of death. The front line of the blood warriors reached the first buildings, their grotesque forms dripping with thick blackened blood as they twisted and writhed onto the solid ground. But something was wrong. The village was not open. It was closed, funneled. They should have been able to spread out, overrun the streets, flood into the alleys, but they couldn't. The houses were boarded up. Every path was closed off. There was only one way forward, and as they moved deeper, they saw it. Bodies, blood, torn limbs littering the dirt. Some were real, ripped from the feeding grounds. Some were not, fabricated horrors, designed to look like the aftermath of a massacre. But the blood warriors did not see the deception. They saw one thing. Death had already come, and Duncan had returned, marching toward the house of the Master. The blood warriors crawled, shambled, and charged through the village, their screams echoing like a symphony of torment. Every footstep splashed through the soaked ground, every movement funneling them toward one destination, the master's house, the place where Duncan had ruled for so long, where he had slaughtered before, and where he waited. They did not slow. They did not question. They moved as one, pressing forward through the village, funneled by the walls, by the trail of carnage that led them onward. Their numbers swelled, the tide of bodies pushing towards the inevitable confrontation, and as the first line neared the house, the torches burned higher, the blood ran thicker, and the illusion of Duncan's wrath was waiting for them. The dread before the storm. As the blood warriors moved through the village, the weight of something unseen pressed against them. Something was watching. Something was waiting. They had spent centuries feeding on the land, but now, for the first time, they felt as if they were being led to slaughter. They did not know fear. Not yet. But soon they would. Eldritch stood still as a statue, dressed in the grotesque, exaggerated likeness of Duncan McDruston. The armour was twice its normal size, padded to create the illusion of a behemoth, a warrior larger than life. The fires blazed behind him, their blinding glow creating a wall of burning light. Shadows flickered across the twisted armour, hiding the seams, distorting his true form, making him look inhuman. The villagers worked quickly, adjusting torches, ensuring the smoke and light obscured every unnatural movement. Eldritch turned to a short, stout man standing beside him, a man with the deepest, most thunderous voice in the village. "Remember the words," Eldritch whispered. The man nodded, gripping the makeshift megaphone, a funneled metal sheet forged specifically for this moment. "I will," the man rumbled. The horde arrives. The ground trembled. Then, like an unholy tide, the blood warriors flooded the path to the house, clawing, crawling, trampling over one another in their desperate hunger. A wave of deformed bodies, shoulder to shoulder, crashing towards their prize. And then the show began. A booming, godlike voice erupted through the village. "More! Bring me more!" The deep, distorted command echoed off the walls, shaking the very air. In front of the house, the silhouette of Duncan loomed, enormous, monstrous, barely human, and then the carnage began. The illusion of Duncan tore through bodies, ripping apart limbs, sending blood splattering in all directions. Some were real, remnants of corpses taken from the feeding grounds. Some were fake, carefully crafted dummies, stuffed with red-soaked cloth and meat, meant to explode with each devastating strike. The thundering voice rang out again.
"I have waited centuries too long. Bring them all to me, Nocturna."
From the rooftops, villagers hurled severed limbs into the charging horde, making it seem as if Duncan was tearing warriors apart with his bare hands. Another deep laugh rumbled through the air. "Thank you, Nocturna, for lying to them. I could not wait any longer to destroy them." The laugh turned to a snarl, a guttural growl, something unscripted. Eldritch snapped a sideways glance at the man with the megaphone. That wasn't part of the plan. The man's face was pale with the terror, but his mouth curled into a wild grin, caught in the thrill of the deception. One blood warrior broke from the horde, staggering towards the house. From the shadows, two of the strongest villagers struck it with a massive pole, sending it flying backward. The towering illusion of Duncan stepped forward, towering over the broken warrior. The voice boomed once more. "Come back! I need to destroy! I am the master! I must destroy!" The fear spread like a virus. The blood warriors were connected. One mind, one suffering, and now one fear. The master had tricked them. Nocturna had tricked them. They had walked into his trap. A bolt of terror shot through their connection like lightning. They turned. They ran. They crawled, clawing over each other, dragging themselves away from the village. A stampede of mindless terror, crashing backward into the feeding grounds, vanishing into the infinite abyss. The deep voice screamed after them, giving chase. "Come back! I need you! Come back!" But they were already gone. The village stood in eerie silence. Only the crackling of the fires remained. And then Eldritch exhaled. They had won. Time passed. The remnants of their deception, the fake blood, the severed limbs, the makeshift corpses, were gathered. The villagers worked together, crafting something permanent. They built effigies of Duncan McDruston, standing tall and immovable, their monstrous size casting shadows over the village. An eternal guardian, one that would never move, never rage, but would always be seen. The village returned to its quiet existence. For the first time in an eternity, there was no Duncan, no blood warriors, no fear. And yet, Eldritch felt no peace. Once again, he stood at the edge of the feeding grounds, staring into the abyss of writhing crimson. He had done it. "I did it, Winter." A shadow moved behind him. A figure stepped out of the darkness. Nocturna. "Eldritch, Eldritch, what will I do with you?" Eldritch did not hesitate. "Send me back." Nocturna laughed, slow and amused. "You know I cannot—" Eldritch's fists clenched. "Then I am stuck here forever." Nocturna smirked. "Maybe not." He reached into the folds of his robes and held out a gem. Crimson tear. It pulsed with unnatural energy, its surface swirling like liquid blood trapped in glass. "Agree to my challenge, Eldritch," Nocturna said. "There are 7 trials. Even I do not know what they will be. Only the tear does. It will transport you to each challenge one after the next. If you fail, well, then you will be my new champion, here for eternity, keeping the balance of this village." Eldritch's eyes narrowed. "And if I succeed?" Nocturna grinned. "Then you will be free. The Crimson Tear, with the aid of the gods, will return you to where you belong." Eldritch stared at the gem. "What are these challenges?" Nocturna's smile deepened. "I won't lie to you, Eldritch. I do not think you can complete them." Eldritch said nothing. "You will have no power, no aid from Winter. Just you, one man." Nocturna's voice lowered, almost a whisper. "The realms you enter will belong to the gods. Maybe Lysanor, maybe Necros, maybe mine, maybe even Earth itself. You will face supernatural being of these realms without power, without strength, just your wits." He tilted his head. "How will you, a mere man, defeat an elder, a lichen, an undead? I have no idea, but if you're willing to try—" He extended the crimson tear. "Just give the word." Eldritch held Nocturna's gaze. Then he took the gem. "I accept." Nocturna chuckled. "Excellent." The crimson tear flared to life, glowing with an intense bloody radiance. A pulse of energy erupted outward, an explosion of crimson light. Eldritch vanished. Nocturna stood alone, watching the last traces of light fade into the eternal black. His grin widened. "Soon, Eldritch, you will be my champion." His voice was soft, cruel. "No one has ever completed the 7 trials." A low chuckle, then a full, booming laugh. "No one has even made it through the first." To be continued in Eldritch and the Crimson Tear.
I should be dead. Nocturna should have claimed me like all the others, fed on me for eternity. But instead, he gave me an offer. 7 trials, 7 realms, no powers, no allies, just me. If I survive them all, I'll be free. But if I fail, I will become his champion, trapped for eternity.
No one has ever completed the 7 trials, Eldritch.
No one has even survived the first. Then let's make history.